Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be hearing about one man who made an incredible difference for Israel. That was President Harry Truman. Warm welcome to the programme. And my guest today is all the way from Finland. His name is Risto Huvila. And welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Sam.
It's a pleasure. And you've written this incredible new book called The Miracle of Israel and President Truman. So in today's programme, we're going to be talking about Truman. But before we do, can you please share with us how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ?
I am the third generation Pentecostal. And I think it was a youth rally when I was 13, 14 years old when, of course, I've been in the church since the beginning. But somehow I remember in that rally the Lord spoke to me and I needed to make my choice for him, and I did. And it was a major decision. Not terms on my, let's say, inner Christian beliefs or faith, but how I came out as a Christian at school. And that was a difference. I became pretty loud and open with my Christianity and with Jesus. And that was a major difference.
Excellent. And when did the Lord place a real love for Israel and the Jewish people upon your heart, Risto?
Exactly 13 years ago. It was, in Finland we have Father's Day the second Sunday of November. And Father's Day 2005, the Lord intervened into my life through an elder from my church. And so he conveyed a message from the Lord. And it really struck me. And a lot of things started to bubble within. And the Lord really put me in a position that I had to really make a difference in my life. As I told, I was a Christian since my childhood. But when you are 40 plus, so there are a lot of things that follows you, at least when you are a business guy. And the Lord really wanted to make a difference in my life. And many things changed internally, but two things changed that are really impacting my ministry. And one of them is that the Lord gave me a gift to write songs. I've been a pianist and music has always been part of my life. But the Lord gave me a gift to write songs, and during the past 13 years, I have written about 150 songs, melodies and lyrics, and music ministry is a big part of my life. But the other thing that the Lord gave to me was, first it was interest for Israel and the Jewish people. But suddenly it changed into love for Israel and the Jewish people. And now I've been, living the last 13 years, studying the scriptures, the history. And the story of Israel is so exciting. The history of Israel is so exciting. And normally when we talk about history, it's something that took place in the past. years ago. But God's history, which is his story, not history, but his story,
Absolutely.
is past, present, and future. And God's history is so exciting, and the Bible opens it up for us. So.
Excellent. When it comes down to your homeland, Finland. Now, I've met a lot of Finns in my work in the European Parliament, including many members of the European Parliament, together with Thomas Sandell, who I work with in the European Parliament to record the European report. What is it about your nation in particular that there are so many strong supporters of Israel? I mean, probably one of the strongest supporters in Europe when it comes to standing up for Israel. Why is this the case regarding Finland?
I don't know. You know, I have heard also that somebody has said that Finland is a superpower when it comes to the love for Israel. And we have a lot of pro-Israel people in different churches, and even in the secular world and in the parliament. People who are not active Christians, but they appreciate the only democracy in the Middle East, and there are certain similarities. Both Israel and Finland, we have lived in a very challenging neighborhood. We have 1,300 kilometers border with Russia. It used to be Soviet Union, if you recall it. And so the threat has been there. Finland and Israel, we have blue and white colors in our flags.
Yeah.
And there are certain similarities, but I really don't know.
Okay, I think that's a good enough explanation, Risto. Now, where did your passion for Harry Truman come from? And what was it about Harry Truman that inspired you to write this book, particularly now as it's the 70th anniversary of the re-establishment of the State of Israel? And President Truman played a huge role in helping to re-establish the State of Israel back on the 14th of May, 1948.
I used to work for a Finnish technology company, and I was in charge of international operations, and for 6 years I was in charge of our US operations, a small company. Operations is a too big word for that, but anyway, I traveled to the US and in the US frequently, very often on a monthly basis, and it was May 2012. I flew to Kansas City to meet a major customer, and it was really tough to get that appointment arranged with them, and I went to meet them. Nothing came out from that meeting, but I had a long afternoon available, and I was thinking in the morning when I was at the hotel, what should I do? Where should I go? And actually, I found that in Kansas City there is the International House of Prayer, and I went there later in the evening. But the afternoon was very long without, any purpose on that afternoon. And I found a brochure for Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum in the outskirts of Kansas City. And somehow the office of U.S. President has been very exciting to me for many years, and I've been visiting those presidential libraries and museums in other places in the US, and I wanted to get there, and I did.
Excellent. So let's have a look now at the life of President Harry Truman, who came to power during World War II after the death of Roosevelt.
On January 20th, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated for an unprecedented fourth presidential term. For the past 12 years, he had successfully guided the nation through the Great Depression and was in the midst of leading it toward victory in World War II. For many Americans, he was the only president they had ever known. But unbeknownst to the public, he was in failing health. On April 12, 1945, FDR's third vice president in 4 terms, Harry S. Truman, received an urgent call. Only 3 months into his new job, Truman was asked to come quickly but quietly to the White House. Waiting for him was not FDR, but the First Lady. "Harry," she said, "the president is dead." Stunned, Truman responded, "Is there anything we can do for you?" "No," Eleanor replied. "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." Number 33, Harry S. Truman, Democrat, 1945 to 1953, 60 years old, from Missouri. If Truman was astonished to learn that he had suddenly become President of the United States, the world was stunned.
It was quite a shock. Americans, the world, sort of held their breath to see what Truman would do.
He was really not that much of a national or worldly figure, so people were appalled. Everybody said, "Who is this man Truman? Woe is the nation, because we've got this ignoramus from Missouri who doesn't know anything about the world," and on and on and on. Well, he fooled them.
Truman had led an average, undistinguished life until getting involved in politics at age 50. Before then, he'd been a farmer and a businessman.
Harry Truman was a failed haberdasher from Kansas City, Missouri in some ways, but he was plain-spoken, he was blunt, he was a good leader, and he had common sense. And it shows that it's not depth of knowledge, but that good basic common sense that's so important to the American presidency.
Truman was not one to mince words.
He's called peppery. Some might say dyspeptic, some might say occasionally profane, certainly plain-spoken. He called a spade, and sometimes worse than a spade.
Well, during my lifetime, Harry Truman was my favorite. I admired him very much. I admired his honesty, his down-to-earth kind of approach to government, his willingness to make politically controversial decisions if he thought they were right, no matter how much it cost him in popular support.
One such decision confronted him almost immediately. After taking the oath, Truman was told for the first time about the Manhattan Project. This new president now faced the most consequential decision a president or any leader has ever had to make: the choice of dropping the first atomic bomb. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in the European theater was over. Yet the U.S. was still preparing for what looked to be a costly invasion of Japan.
The estimates were any place from 1 million to 500,000 casualties if you invaded Japan, and you had this weapon. And I think this was a clear-cut decision, and old Harry Truman's Missouri common sense just came through.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
On August 15, 1945, the Japanese surrendered. World War II was over. Truman's initial decisiveness would come to define his presidency.
He believed that it was important, both for his own political credibility and also for the position of the United States at this critical moment at the end of the war, to make decisions and stick with it. He did adopt the motto that the buck stopped here, meaning the desk of the president, and that was something that a lot of people came to admire.
Although the war had ended, a new struggle was beginning. The United States versus the USSR, capitalism versus communism.
He gathers what we call the wise men, these great titans of foreign policy, to come help him figure out how to deal with the Soviet Union.
It was Harry Truman, George Marshall, and Dean Acheson who devised communist containment, the idea of containing the spread of communism, not trying to eliminate it militarily, waging a war of ideas in the confident belief that over time capitalism would prevail and Western democracy.
The policy of containment came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. It asserted America's right to support any nation in its struggle to fend off communist aggression. To rebuild war-ravaged Western Europe, thought to be vulnerable to the communist threat, Truman put forward the Marshall Plan.
The United States government spent upwards of $12 to $14 billion in the reconstruction of Europe. And nearly everybody, historians, political scientists, contemporaries, judged the Marshall Plan a resounding success.
By advancing the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and NATO, Truman hoped America would serve as a role model of democracy for the world. Yet while promoting equality and fighting poverty abroad, Truman faced inequality at home.
He understood the hypocrisy between having just fought a war, ostensibly, against racism, and yet racism embedded in every aspect of American life.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, or religion, or race, or color.
In January 1948, Truman boldly ended segregation in the armed forces and the civil service by executive order.
That was the presidency of Harry Truman. Quite remarkable. I love seeing those old archive footages of President Truman. But what kind of man was President Truman, and what impact did his Christian faith and the Bible have on him in terms of his decision-making?
First of all, I think that those clips didn't really show the struggle he lived until he succeeded. And he was a failure in business, and then a local Democratic leader in Kansas City came to him and said that, you know, you have failed in business, why wouldn't you try politics? And Harry Truman had nothing to lose, so he signed up for a local elections, and he got elected, but only for 2 years, and then he lost his position again. He became a salesman for the Kansas City Automobile Club and barely made his living. He was already then married with one child. And again, in 2 years, so he was challenged to try again. And then he succeeded again and was elected. He had a 4-year term as kind of an administrational justice, responsible for public works in Kansas City and outskirts, hospitals, roads, bridges, etc. And he succeeded really well. And then the New Deal came from the White House and President Roosevelt, and Harry Truman was he became the leader of the Missouri Employment Program, which was the federal program. And the unemployment was very high at the time. And again, Truman succeeded in that position. And because of that success, he was encouraged to run for the Senate, for the US Senate in Washington. He did, he got elected, very narrow, after very narrow votes, and in 1934, he became senator, and basically that was kind of a steady and easier part of his life. He's been struggling in business and in politics and all kind of corruption while he was in local administration in Kansas City and also federal administration. So it wasn't too easy for him. But he was very a man with integrity, and he succeeded really well, and that's why he was able to go to the Senate.
Why do you think that President Roosevelt decided to appoint him as his vice president 3 months before he died? Because he is, by history, called the unexpected president, because no one thought he would be president.
Accidental president. That's the word many historians are describing. It wasn't Roosevelt's pick. He wasn't. Roosevelt already was on his 3rd term, and Henry Wallace was his vice president. But suddenly, Mr. Wallace started to have meetings, and he spent time with communists and union leaders, and he went to Soviet Union. and he studied Spanish, which was not kind of a credit for him at that time. And also he went to see, what's the English word for some kind of a fortune teller.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, fortune teller.
And that came public, and all the democratic leaders immediately wanted to change the vice president. And they started to find out who were capable to become candidate for vice president for Roosevelt. And they had, you know, number of men, many men, and Harry Truman was not among those guys until very last moment when the Democratic convention in July '44, there were 7 candidates signed up for the nomination. Harry Truman was not among them. And he has really rejected all the invitations to join the presidential ticket. And suddenly, just a few days before the vote, a few candidates were ousted because of their what they had done, and just came to public. At that time, there were no internet. There was no internet yet, but the rumors came, and a few candidates disappeared, and Harry Truman was invited. Why wouldn't you come and join this ticket? And Roosevelt wasn't favorable for Truman. But it was actually Roosevelt didn't, he had said that I'm okay with anybody you choose. And the convention, the first round of the voting, the sitting Vice President Henry Wallace was #1, but didn't have majority of the votes. But the second round, suddenly and surprisingly, Harry Truman was #1 and elected as a candidate for Vice President.
Excellent. And can you tell us about his Christian faith? Because, you know, nowadays we would find it very, very difficult to believe that in the Democrat Party that you could have a Christian who had a strong biblical mooring, as it were.
Harry, he was raised in a Baptist family in Missouri, and his mother was a strong believer. And in his memoirs, Harry Truman tells that by age of 12, he had read the Bible through twice. And as he recalls in his memoirs and other biographies, so he was very excited, first of all, about the certain heroes of the Bible. But what already touched him before he was 12 years old was prophecies about the Jewish people, that they would end up in their ancient homeland in the end of the days. And that was actually his conviction and understanding. And already when the Second World War broke out, and when he was a senator, so he was very strong. At that time, they called him and those people pro-Palestine, pro-Jewish Palestine, and he wanted to have the Jewish state. And the Great Britain, your Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who came into power around the same time when Truman became president. Yeah, so they were opponents. But Truman's biblical worldview, and especially on the Jewish people and on Palestine, was so strong that he really worked hard and did everything against all odds and all his government and advisors.
So let's have a look now at this excellent video, and this is Truman and Israel.
I was told by all these so-called experts, that if it was done, it would involve the whole Near East in a war, and it would also involve the United States. Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. I saw it, and I dream about it even to this day. The Jews needed some place where they could go. It was my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives.
Marshall was worried that war would break out.
We are in the midst of a very critical situation. We should therefore carefully avoid approaching international problems on an emotional basis.
He wanted to maintain good relations with the Arabs.
I was on the receiving end of Azam Pasha's impressions of his meeting with Marshall. And he was happy. I mean, he felt much more reassured about the Americans after having talked to Marshall than before. And we had the Saudis with us. They were our partners in this business.
2 days before the British left Palestine, Truman summoned Marshall to the White House. Clark Clifford was asked to support the case for a Jewish state.
General Marshall started off. The president listened attentively and then said, I would like now to hear from Clark. But as I spoke, I saw Marshall's face getting redder and redder. And when I finished, he exploded.
Marshall accused Truman of a transparent dodge to win the Jewish vote.
Clark Clifford did not disguise the fact that Marshall was raging mad. They don't need a state, they don't deserve a state, it isn't theirs. They've stolen that land. These were Marshall's words.
He turned to the president, said, I'm obliged, Mr. President, to tell you that if you should adopt the policy that is recommended by Clifford, I would be unable to vote for you in this coming election in November. Well, dead silence in the room. No one had ever heard anything like that. I had never heard anybody threaten the President of the United States in that manner.
Before Marshall could go any further, Truman ended the meeting.
I gathered my papers together, and the president said, well, that was tough as a cob.
Marshall said to Charette, well, it's your decision. Don't count that we can bail you out, but we know that you have reached an historic stage, and God protect you.
And there we see that President Truman had a battle on his hands. His own Secretary of State was opposed to him, as well as the entire intelligence community, in recognizing the Jewish state of Israel back in May 1948. Now, Truman was an incredibly strong character, primarily because his US Secretary of State, George Marshall, threatened that he wouldn't help him get re-elected. He had his own intelligence against him, saying he shouldn't back and recognize a Jewish state. But what was it that convicted President Truman to recognize the state of Israel and to go against the advice of virtually everyone in his own government?
I would go back a bit. You know, the May 1248, when that meeting was in the Oval Office, was kind of a almost in the end of the process. But Truman started the process immediately when he became the president. He received a report from Europe, from the death camps, and he read a long report. I'm quoting very quite a bit of that report in my book, and George Harrison, who was in charge of that report, so writes in detail about the conditions where the Jews are in concentration camps months after the liberation of those camps. So the first camp was liberated in January 45, Auschwitz-Birkenau. And these reports comes in September, August-September 45, 6 months after the liberation. And Mr. Harrison is writing that the Jews are still behind barbed wires. They are still undernourished, and nobody's taking care of them medically, and they are still using the pyjamas, and even when the autumn is coming, they have to use Nazi uniforms. And that was the situation with the Jews months after the liberation of the camps in Germany and in Europe. And Truman really understands that this is my moment now. And he starts working to help the Jews in the camps. There were about 300,000 Jews in the European camps then. And suddenly, the Labour here in the UK takes over, and Truman really needs to fight hard against Prime Minister Attlee. And then in February 47, the UK had it enough with the mandate in Palestine and throws the ball to the United Nations.
Yep.
And they start to figure out about the future of the mandate of Palestine. And that phase ends up in November 29th, 47, when the General Assembly of the United Nations is voting and having 2/3 majority for the separate Jewish state and Arab state. The partition plan was then accepted. And that was the first major international task for President Truman, because there were no 2/3 majority for the Jewish state in the world at that moment. And we already knew that how the countries and administrations all over, how they treated Jews before the war broke out. And Truman worked hard to get those 2/3 majority. And one funny thing I'm writing about is Liberia was one of the countries that was against the Jewish state. And Truman tells his advisor, hey, please take a phone call to Mr. Goodyear. No, sorry, Firestone. And Mr. Firestone had rubber plants in Liberia. And Truman said to his advisor, please tell Mr. Firestone that I'm afraid that if Liberia is not lining up with us for the Jewish state, so you may not have any more business in Liberia, and all your rubber trees and they will be gone. And suddenly, Liberia, the president of Liberia, started to think differently, and they voted for the partition. And Truman really worked hard to get the votes. And I'm describing this process in very detail in this book. And it's kind of a funny story, but also tough to understand how the world was already then, and of course, as it has been at all times, against the Jews and the Jewish nation.
Let's have a look now at what happened on May the 12th, 1948, in this dramatic drive by the American Jewish community and also the representative of the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann, to get the United States to recognize the State of Israel.
Throughout the war, he pushed for the creation of a Jewish brigade, which didn't happen until the end of the war. He also lobbied Britain to let thousands of European Jews into Palestine, which didn't happen at all. After the war, he renewed his calls for a state. By now, there was a new American president in the White House, and it was Weizmann's job to win him over.
Harry Truman comes into the White House overwhelmed. He says, "I felt like the sun and the moon and the stars had fallen on me." Truman has to get his own bearings in office. It's just a very, very complicated job. And all of a sudden, on top of this, comes this Palestine file. And the Palestine file is triply complicated. On the one hand, you have Jewish leaders and Jewish advisors and millions of non-Jews saying the right thing to do is to give the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine. You have the Arab dimension, where Arabs with oil money and with tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people are saying, no way, we don't want a Jewish state in here.
In 1947, the British announced that they were withdrawing from Palestine. And in November, the United Nations voted to partition the land into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. President Truman supported the move at first, but 4 months later, he wavered under pressure from his State Department. Weizmann and other Jewish leaders were in a state of near panic. They needed American support, but Truman's door had been slammed shut.
He also doesn't like to be pushed around. And as the lobbying gets more intense, he shuts down. I've had enough. But what do? History is knocking on the door. Things are changing. There's a date now, May 15th, 1948, when Israel's become a state, when the British are going to leave. What's going to happen? What do?
Weizmann confided his fears to American Zionist Dewey Stone, who then told his friend Frank Goldman. The two were attending a dinner for a Jewish organization in Boston.
I just spent the day with Chaim Weizmann. He thinks that he can convince Truman to turn around on petition, but he can't get into the White House. Truman is shutting everyone out.
I think I can help.
Goldman had just met Harry Truman's old friend and business partner, Eddie Jacobson, one of the few people with an open door to the Oval Office. They decided to telephone Jacobson in Missouri right away, but neither of them had any coins. So they had to go from guest to guest until they had scraped up enough change to make the long-distance call.
Eddie? It's Frank Goldman. I have a favor to ask you.
Jacobson came east on the next train and called Truman immediately. Truman agreed to see him on one condition. There would be no talk of Palestine.
Eddie, you son of a gun. You promised you wouldn't say a word.
Mr. President, I didn't say a word. But I think of all those homeless Jews, homeless for thousands of years. And then I think of Dr. Weizmann. I can't help it. He spent his entire life working for a homeland for the Jews, and now he's old and he's sick. He just wants to see.
That's enough. Now, that's the last word. That's all they want to talk about.
We talked about this and that, but
just too much going on.
Every once in a while, a big tear would roll down his cheek.
Eddie, you bald-headed son of a gun. I ought to have you thrown right out of here. You knew perfectly well that I couldn't stand to see you cry.
Mr. President, thank you.
After he was gone, I picked up the phone and called the State Department. I told them I was going to see Weizmann. And well, you should have heard the carrying on.
And what we also have to remember is that there are very powerful forces saying don't do it. And especially in the State Department, but also at this time in the Department of Defense, the leaders And also, the main bureaucrats are saying don't do it. And Harry Truman, to his credit, despite tremendous pressure from both sides, makes the decision based on what Harry Truman believes.
The clock was ticking, and Chaim Weizmann had just one chance to change Truman's mind.
He was great in a face-to-face talk. He could say the right thing at the right time. He could tell you really what you want to hear. The basic things, the advisor looked in his eyes and said, well, historically, nobody will remember you if you reject the Zionist or the state for the Jews. If you support it, you will be remembered. This is Chaim Weizmann.
Certainly that was a date with destiny, as that decided the fate of the new Jewish nation. Risto, now I just got a quote from Chaim Weizmann, then leader of the Zionist movement, who then went on to become Israel's first president, in which he handed a letter a few weeks earlier to President Truman, in which he wrote this. He said, "The choice for our people, Mr. President, is between statehood and extermination. History and Providence have placed this issue in your hands, and I'm confident that you will yet decide it in the spirit of the moral law." How important was this meeting with Chaim Weizmann and President Truman to convince President Truman that he should recognize the new Jewish state of Israel?
I think it has an importance, but somehow Truman, through those years, he was so convinced to help the Jewish state that it would be founded. And I think that's, as one of his advisors in one book, or in many books, he says, and he's quoted, that Truman really didn't need Jews to establish the state of Israel. So his personal beliefs, biblical views, and understanding was so strong. And what Truman, at one point, what he did, he closed the doors of the White House, and he said that, "I'm not going to meet any Jewish leaders anymore. I'm done with them." And that was largely understood that Truman is against the Jewish state and against the Jewish community. But no, he was fed up with those hundreds of Jewish leaders, and each of them had a different perspective and opinion about the upcoming Jewish state. And I think that Chaim Weizmann was very genuine in this moment, and also Eddie Jacobson, because they didn't know how Truman felt about the whole issue and what he was about to do. But it seems, I've been studying these hundreds of hours about his letters and memorandums and speeches. He was so pro-Jewish state from the beginning. And he needed to play domestic politics, and that's why he needed to show others that he's not going according to the orders from the Jewish community. And actually he didn't do and didn't help found the Jewish state based on the requests from the Jewish community, but orders from the scriptures.
Risto, we're down to 5 minutes of the program, so I kind of really need to sum up a little bit. Now, we've seen that President Truman has gone down in history as the American president who recognized Israel's right to exist and recognized Israel as a new nation. But also he was rewarded for doing that by actually winning the general election, presidential election in November of 1948, which was a complete surprise to everyone. What sort of legacy has President Truman left behind?
Very diverse. Atomic bomb, NATO, CIA, and this segregation issue, he wanted to change really the situation in the army and the federal administration. But I think that if we look at the world history, Israel is there because of Harry Truman was obedient. And I think that if you have a righteous heart and your heart is right with God, you can be a failure and God knows your number. He can take you to the position where He needs you. And I think for me it's a great lesson that you don't need to sit on the front row to be noticed that there is a candidate available. You can be there as little David was in the fields. He wasn't with 7 brothers to be chosen and anointed for the next king of Israel. All the big brothers, handsome, powerful, were there. And the very same situation was with the Democratic Party in 44. All these leaders and politicians, and Harry Truman was in the field, taking care of his things. He wasn't interested. But when God called him, he obeyed and he understood his position in the world as the strongest world leader. And he did what he was supposed to do.
Absolutely. And also shows us what a difference it makes when we have a biblical worldview, when positions of power and influence like President Truman was, to go against the State Department, to go against the US intelligence agencies and to recognize the State of Israel, but also his strong friendship with David Ben-Gurion, because we showed some old footage of Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, meeting President Truman in the White House. How did those two get on?
I don't think they were close friends. It was one meeting at the White House. A menorah was given to the president, and I think what I regret on behalf of Harry Truman is that he never traveled to Israel. And almost he did, but his friend Eddie Jacobson died, and they had agreed to go there together, and Harry Truman never did. So I think Harry Truman, he knew a lot of Jewish leaders, and he met many of them during the process and after the Declaration of Independence. But I think he lived a life based on his own understanding and convictions of the Bible. And he didn't please the Jewish leaders. Even he did, of course, but he wanted to please God. And that's something which is remarkable as a world leader, and how strong his beliefs and faith in Bible was, and not only the Old Testament prophecies, but when he talks and writes about Jesus, and that he is the only way to Almighty God. So he really knew what he was talking about and writing about.
Excellent. We're down to the last minute or so of the programme. So, Risto, can you tell us how our viewers can get hold of your excellent new book on the miracle of Israel and President Truman?
I'm working on having a distributor here in the UK. And at the moment, if you want to have it, you can go to my webpage, truman.fi for Finland. So you can find further information on the book and Harry Truman and get the book.
Yeah. Risto, I just want to thank you so much for flying in all the way from Finland to be my guest, and thank you for the wonderful research that you've done in your new book about President Truman and the role that God used him in helping to re-establish the State of Israel 70 years ago, in 1948.
Thank you, Simon. A pleasure.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you all for watching this programme today. And, you know, we have to look at the legacy left behind by President Harry Truman in recognising the State of Israel, because he showed courage and determination to go against the advice of his own State Department and the intelligence agencies in recognising the Jewish State of Israel. And today, because of his strong support of Israel that came through his biblical convictions, we see that the State of Israel today is 70 years old as a nation reborn. And he played a major role in helping to re-establish the State of Israel. So this song is in tribute to the great man himself, Harry Truman.
Wore big glasses and spent much time reading. Snuck into the army, memorizing an eye chart. Captain in World War I of the Dizzy Dees. He was a farmer, never went to college, lifelong Democrat, failed businessman. No one heard of him before he was 50. He played piano well. Piano solo. Made from independent, down to earth and average. Determined, never gave up. Always unassuming. Jackson County judge, thanks to my Pendergast. Love people, and boy, they sure loved him back. Crisscross Missouri to become senator. Helped in his management in the defense industry. Then what happened came as a great shock. Asked to be Roosevelt's vice president. His worst fear came true when Roosevelt died. He now was in charge to end World War II. Made the tough choice to drop the atom bomb, bringing World War II to a deadly close. Offered the United Nations all about the Marshall Plan, containment of communism. That was the Truman Doctrine. Soon Korea needed help. Truman then sent troops to them. But here we go again, less than 5 years later, back at war, back at war. The Cold War has begun. Time to police the world. The Cold War has begun. Harry Truman, man from independent. Harry Truman, down to earth and average. Harry Truman, determined, never gave up. Harry Truman, always unassuming. Fire and Arthur, yeah, the bomb stops here. Foreign policy defined his presidency. His fair deal called for progressive ideals. Underdog when earth and average. Harry Truman, determined, never gave up. Harry Truman, always unassuming. Man from independence, down to earth and average. Determined, never gave up. Always unassuming.